Mark, a struggling barista working long hours to make ends meet, often saw the same faces at the cafe. One cold morning, he noticed a man shivering outside the door, clearly homeless. Feeling a sense of empathy, Mark quietly offered the man a warm cup of coffee, never expecting anything in return. Little did he know, the small act of kindness would set off a chain of events that would change his life forever. Just a few hours later, a group of men in suits entered the cafe, their presence marking the beginning of an unexpected twist in Mark's journey. Mark had worked at the small corner cafe for almost 2 years now. The days seemed to blend into one another, each shift the same as the last. The usual customers came in, ordered their coffees, then rushed out the door without so much as a glance. He often wondered if anyone noticed the tired eyes behind the counter or the person who made their daily coffee. But on this cold morning, something caught Mark's attention. As he steamed milk for a latte, he glanced up at the window. There, huddled in a worn jacket, was a man who looked like he hadn't slept indoors in days. His face was pale, his hands trembling as he tried to warm himself in the cold. Mark knew that feeling, the cold, the exhaustion. Though he had never been homeless, he understood struggle. He hesitated for a moment. The cafe policy was strict about giving away free items. But something inside him pushed him forward. Mark made a cup of hot coffee. He walked over to the man outside and handed it to him without a word. The man looked up, his eyes filled with surprise and gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice rough from the cold. Mark nodded, offering a small smile before heading back inside. It was just a cup of coffee, he thought, a small gesture. But it felt like the right thing to do. Inside the warmth of the cafe, life went on as usual. Customers came and went. But Mark's mind kept drifting back to the man outside. He wondered if the coffee had helped, if the man would find shelter for the night. He didn't dwell on it for long, though. There was always another order to fill. Hours passed. The morning rush slowed to a trickle, and the quiet hum of the cafe filled the air. It felt like any other day, at least until the door swung open. The bell above the cafe door chimed. Mark looked up from the counter. A group of men, dressed sharply in dark suits, walked in. Their presence immediately drew attention. They seemed out of place in the small, cozy cafe. The usual crowd was a mix of students, locals, and regulars, but these men had an air of importance about them. Mark's heart skipped a beat. He quickly wiped his hands on his apron, trying to appear calm. He wasn't sure what to expect. Were they here for a meeting? Or maybe they had the wrong place? One of the men, tall with silver hair and sharp eyes, approached the counter. "You're Mark, right?" he asked. His voice was steady, but there was something behind it. Curiosity or maybe something more. Mark nodded slowly. "Yes, I'm Mark. Can I help you?" The man smiled slightly, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "We'd like to speak with you about something important. It won't take long. Do you have a moment?" Mark glanced around the cafe. It was quieter now, only a few customers lingering with their drinks. He didn't have much of a choice. "Sure. What's this about?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The man gestured to a table near the back. "Let's talk over there. It's a private matter." Mark hesitated for a second, then followed them. His mind raced with possibilities. What could they possibly want with him? He wasn't anyone special, just a barista trying to get by. They sat down at the table. The men in suits surrounded him, making him feel small in comparison. The leader, the man with silver hair, leaned forward slightly. His gaze was intense. "Earlier today, you gave a coffee to someone outside, didn't you? A homeless man?" Mark blinked in surprise. "Yes, I did. Why? Did something happen?" he asked, feeling a knot form in his stomach. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied Mark for a moment. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke again. "That man, the one you helped, he's connected to someone very important." "More than you know." Mark's brow furrowed.
He didn't understand. I just gave him a cup of coffee.
That's all, he said quietly.
The man nodded.
Yes, but sometimes, a small act can lead to much bigger things.
You'll understand soon enough.
Mark sat there, confused and uneasy.
What were they talking about? Why would something as simple as giving coffee to a homeless man attract this kind of attention? Before he could ask more, the man stood up.
We'll be in touch soon, he said, leaving a business card on the table. Then, just as quickly as they had appeared, the men in suits left the cafe. The door closed behind them with a soft click, and silence filled the room. Mark stared down at the card, his hands slightly shaking. The name on it was unfamiliar, but the company logo was one he recognized. It was a major corporation, one that had nothing to do with cafes or homeless shelters.
What was going on? And what did it all mean for him?
Mark couldn't shake the feeling of unease as he tucked the business card into his apron pocket. The men in suits had left just as quickly as they'd come, but their presence lingered in his mind.
What could they possibly want with him?
The rest of his shift felt like a blur. He served coffee, cleaned tables, smiled at customers, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the conversation, the homeless man, and the strange connection that had been hinted at. He knew there was more to the story, but he had no idea what it could be.
When his shift finally ended, Mark stepped outside into the chilly evening air.
He glanced down the street, half expecting to see the men in suits watching him from the shadows. But the street was empty, quiet, just like any other night. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the business card again. The logo, bold and unmistakable, belonged to a company he had heard of before, but it wasn't the kind of company that had anything to do with him. They were into high-profile investments, mergers, and big deals.
What did they want with a barista from a small cafe? Mark's curiosity got the better of him. He decided to search for the company online when he got home.
Maybe there would be something, anything, that could explain the strange encounter.
Later that night, sitting at his small kitchen table, Mark opened his laptop.
His fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment, then he typed the name from the card into the search bar. The results came up quickly: articles about the company's success, its powerful CEO, and the major deals they had made over the years. But one article caught his eye. It was about a major charity initiative the company had started a few years ago. The program was aimed at helping people who had fallen on hard times, homeless individuals, those who had lost everything and were trying to rebuild their lives. And at the center of this initiative was the company's CEO, a man who had once lived on the streets himself. Mark stared at the screen, his heart racing.
Could it be? Was the homeless man he had given coffee to somehow connected to this powerful figure? And if so, why would he come back here? What did he want from Mark?
The next day, Mark went to work as usual, but he couldn't stop thinking about what he had learned. He kept looking at the door, half expecting the men in suits to walk back in. But the day passed without incident. It was just another normal shift, or so it seemed. As Mark cleaned up at the end of the day, the door opened again. His breath caught in his throat. It was the same man from the day before, the one who had led the group in suits. He walked up to the counter, this time alone. "We need to talk," the man said, his voice steady but carrying a weight that made Mark's stomach tighten.
Mark nodded. "Okay. What is this all about?"
"Why are you here?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man placed a small envelope on the counter.
"This is for you."
"It's a gesture of thanks for what you did yesterday," he said, pausing for a moment before continuing.
"The man you helped, he's someone important to us, more important than you could imagine. And we don't forget acts of kindness like that."
Mark looked down at the envelope, confused. But it was just a cup of coffee. Anyone would have done it, he said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. The man shook his head.
"No, not everyone would have. And that's why you're different."
With that, he turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving Mark standing there, staring at the envelope.
Mark stood frozen, the small envelope still resting on the counter.
He hesitated, unsure if he should open it right away. The words of the man echoed in his mind: "We don't forget acts of kindness like that."
Taking a deep breath, he picked up the envelope. It felt heavier than he expected for something so small. With shaking hands, he carefully tore it open and pulled out a neatly folded piece of paper. His eyes widened as he read the words written inside. It was a letter, formal yet brief, expressing deep gratitude for what he had done. But what caught his attention wasn't the words. It was the check tucked inside the paper. Mark's heart skipped a beat as he unfolded it. The amount written in bold numbers was more than he had ever seen in his life, enough to pay off all his debts and more. For a moment, he couldn't believe it. Was this real? Why would they do something like this? He had only given the man a cup of coffee. Surely this was some kind of mistake. Mark sank into a chair, the check still in his hand. His thoughts raced. Who was that homeless man? Why would a simple gesture lead to something so huge? It didn't make sense. The next morning, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. He looked at the check again, still unsure if he should cash it. But his curiosity got the better of him. He decided to contact the number printed on the business card the men had left behind. Later that day, he dialed the number. His heart pounded as the phone rang. A professional voice answered, "Good afternoon. You've reached the office of Mr. Harris. How can we assist you?" Mark cleared his throat, trying to sound calm. Yes. My name is Mark. I was told to call this number regarding an envelope I received." There was a brief pause, then the voice responded. Mr. Harris has been expecting your call. Please hold for a moment." Mark's pulse quickened. A few seconds later, a familiar voice came on the line. It was the same man who had come into the cafe. "Mark, I'm glad you called. We hoped you would." Mark swallowed hard. "Look, I'm really grateful for the gesture, but I don't understand why. Why would you give me something like this? It was just a cup of coffee." The man on the other end chuckled softly. "It's never just a cup of coffee, Mark. Sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness create the biggest ripples. The man you helped, he's someone very close to Mr. Harris. In fact, he is Mr. Harris." Mark's breath caught. "What? The homeless man, he's the CEO?" "Yes," the man replied, his voice steady. "Mr. Harris has a habit of going unnoticed, blending in with the crowds. He likes to see how people react when they think no one's watching. Most people ignore him, but not you. You didn't hesitate to show kindness, and that's why we're offering you an opportunity." Mark's mind was spinning. An opportunity? What kind of opportunity? There was a pause. Then the man spoke again, his tone serious. "Mr. Harris wants to meet with you. He believes someone like you, with your heart, could do more than just make coffee. He's offering you a position within his company, something that could change your life." Mark sat in stunned silence. Was this really happening? Could a simple act of kindness have led to something like this? "We'll be in touch to arrange the details," the man continued. "But for now, consider this a gesture of our gratitude for seeing the humanity in someone that others might overlook." Before Mark could respond, the line went dead. He sat there for a long moment, staring at the phone in his hand. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions: gratitude, disbelief, hope. The following days passed in a blur for Mark. His life, which had once been filled with routine and monotony, now felt like it was on the verge of something much bigger. He couldn't stop thinking about what had happened: the envelope, the conversation on the phone, and the fact that the homeless man he had given coffee to was the CEO of a major corporation. True to their word, the men in suits reached out to Mark again. This time, they arranged for him to meet with Mr. Harris himself. It was surreal, sitting in the lobby of a towering office building, waiting to meet a man who had lived on the streets just days before. When Mark was finally led into the office, he found himself face to face with the same man he had given coffee to. Mr. Harris sat behind a large desk, but there was no arrogance in his demeanor. Instead, he smiled warmly, his eyes filled with the same gratitude Mark had seen outside the cafe that day. "Mark, I'm glad you're here," Mr. Harris said softly, gesturing for him to sit down. I've been looking forward to this conversation.
Mark took a seat, still feeling a bit out of place.
I don't really know what to say. It's all been so overwhelming, he admitted.
I didn't do anything special, just gave you a cup of coffee. Mr. Harris leaned forward slightly, his expression serious but kind.
You did more than that. You saw me when no one else did. You didn't judge. You didn't turn away.
You showed kindness in a world where it's often forgotten.
Mark listened, feeling a lump form in his throat. He had never thought of it that way.
It had just been a small gesture, but hearing it from Mr. Harris made him realize how much it had meant. I believe in giving back, in lifting up those who show the kind of heart you did, Mr. Harris continued. That's why I want to offer you something more, a position in my company. You'll start from the ground up, but you'll have opportunities, real opportunities to grow, to build something for yourself. Mark blinked, still trying to process everything.
But why me? There are so many people more qualified.
I'm just a barista, he said quietly.
Mr. Harris smiled again. That's exactly why, Mark.
You're grounded, humble, and you see people for who they are, not what they have. That's the kind of person I want in my company, someone who understands the value of kindness. For a long moment, Mark sat in silence, trying to wrap his mind around the offer. It was more than just a job. It was a chance to change his life, to finally break free from the cycle of just getting by.
I don't know what to say, Mark finally managed, his voice shaky.
You don't have to say anything right now, Mr. Harris said gently.
Take your time. Think it over.
Whatever you decide, know that your kindness has already made a difference, not just to me, but to everyone who will hear this story. Mark left the office that day with a sense of hope he hadn't felt in years. The weight of his daily struggles seemed lighter, and for the first time in a long time, he could see a future filled with possibilities. A few weeks later, Mark officially accepted the offer. He began his new journey, working at Mr. Harris's company, starting from the ground up just as promised. It wasn't easy at first, the learning curve was steep, and the hours were long. But every day, Mark reminded himself of where he had come from and how a single cup of coffee had changed everything. As the years passed, Mark rose through the ranks. His kindness and empathy continued to set him apart. And though his life had transformed in ways he never imagined, he never forgot the lesson he had learned that cold morning outside the cafe, that sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness create the biggest ripples. Mark sat at his desk, gazing out the window of his new office. The city skyline stretched before him, a testament to how far he had come. He thought back to his days at the cafe, the faces of the regular customers, and the way the smell of coffee would fill the air every morning. He remembered the homeless man, Mr. Harris, standing outside in the cold, and how a single cup of coffee had set everything in motion. Mark, a voice called, breaking his thoughts. He turned to see Lisa, his assistant, standing at the door.
Mr. Harris is on the line. He wants to speak with you. Mark smiled and nodded, picking up the phone.
Mr. Harris, he said warmly, how can I help you?
Mark, I just wanted to check in, Mr. Harris said. You've been doing an incredible job.
The team speaks highly of your leadership and the changes you've implemented.
Thank you, sir. That means a lot coming from you, Mark replied.
I knew you had it in you, Mr. Harris continued. But more importantly, I want you to remember what brought you here, kindness.
It's the foundation of everything we do. Never lose sight of that.
Mark's grip on the phone tightened slightly as he felt a swell of emotion.
I won't, sir. I promise.
After the call, Mark sat back in his chair, the weight of Mr. Harris's words sinking in. He had come a long way, but he knew the journey wasn't just about him. It was about the ripple effect of kindness, how one small gesture could create waves that touched countless lives. One day, as Mark walked into the break room, he overheard two employees talking.
Did you hear about that new initiative Mark proposed? It's going to help so many people, one of them said.
Yeah, he's really making a difference here, the other replied. I heard he started from the bottom too. Just goes to show what a little heart can do. Mark smiled to himself, their words a quiet affirmation that he was on the right path. He had turned his own life around, but he was also helping others do the same. The cycle of kindness continued.
As he returned to his office, Mark noticed a small envelope on his desk.
Curious, he opened it and found a handwritten note.
It read, "Mark, thank you for believing in me and giving me a chance. I won't let you down. Sarah." Mark recognized the name immediately.
Sarah was a young woman he had recently hired, someone who reminded him of himself when he first started. She had been struggling, unsure of her place in the world, but Mark had seen her potential. The note was a reminder that his actions had a profound impact, just as Mr. Harris's had on him. The lessons Mark had learned stayed with him. Every decision he made, every person he helped, was a reflection of the simple truth he had discovered: kindness could change lives. And as he sat at his desk, watching the sun set over the city, he knew that the ripples of that one cup of coffee would continue to spread, touching lives in ways he could only begin to imagine.